Hi, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here for this in a virtual sense. Um, I'm Gideon Oliver. I appreciate the introduction, he, him pronouns. Um, I need to preface this by saying that, what I'm gonna tell you is not legal advice. It's just legal information. You get legal advice by talking to a lawyer, reaching out to a lawyer for legal advice, and then talking to them and getting it. So this is not a substitute for legal advice. It's legal information. And although this is not exactly protest specific, if there's anything you remember from this Know Your Rights, it should be sort of the four things that you should know to say in most law enforcement encounters, which are, am I free to leave? And if you're free to leave, then you can leave. That's the first thing, am I free to leave? The second is, I do not consent to this search, which is the thing you can say and you should say if you don't consent to a search, even if the police are going to do it anyway. The third thing to say is, I want to talk to a lawyer. And the fourth thing to say is, I want to remain silent. And then the thing to do is to exercise those rights, for example, by remaining silent until you talk to a lawyer. So that's a preface. We'll come back to some of those concepts. And again, those are not specific to protest, arrest or detention kind of situation, but they are applicable. And then I guess I want to say, there are a lot of Know Your Rights resources out there that people can find on the internet. And the National Lawyers Guild, national organization, has Know Your Rights resources in a number of languages that are cover protest situations, among others. The National Lawyers Guild New York City chapter has resources available. Legal collectives in New York, the Mutant Legal Collective is one, but there are legal collectives in places across the country that are also good Know Your Rights resources. The Center for Constitutional Rights, CCR, has good resources. The Legal Aid Society in New York and other public defenders organizations have good Know Your Rights resources online, and the New York Civil Liberties Union also has good resources online. And I may paste some of those links into the chat a little bit later if there's some time, but you can Google all of those resources. And so there are a lot of Know Your Rights resources out there you can avail yourselves of. What I want to do today is to talk about sort of Know Your Rights in the context of protests. And I want to start by talking about sort of general risks and roles. I see a bunch of those links popped up in the chat. Thank you so much. I want to talk about our general risks and roles. And the bottom line is, you have to do, as a person who's going to attend or be an observer at a protest, you have to do what keeps you safe and what you feel safe. And there's a principle in organizing that we keep us safe. And so you have to do things to keep yourself safe when you go to protest, because very often in New York City, going to a protest can when you go to a protest, you expose yourself to police misconduct. And unfortunately, police misconduct in connection with protest policing has been a rampant problem for a really long time. And as we've seen recently, is always ready to, is always there, and is always, the police are often in situations where they simply escalate, and there isn't long-term accountability or real incentives for police not to engage in that kind of misconduct. So the concept of we keep us safe is, one that I'll probably be coming back to. There are, risks that are created sometimes by the way the police engage with protests, that you have to think about, at the front end, I think, in terms of your own health and safety. And then, of course, you have rights. So there are rights and risks, and we'll talk more specifically about your rights. I want to talk a little bit about some common roles that are played at protests aside from protesters and police. The National Lawyers Guild is a national organization. We have legal observers who are lawyers and legal workers who are trained to observe and document police responses to protests. They have very colorful green hats that they wear, such as this is one. So they're easily identifiable to police and to protesters. They're there to observe police and police response to protests. They're not there to negotiate between organizers and police or play any sort of intermediary role. But if people are arrested, one function that legal observers serve is to collect the names of people who are arrested on the street, so that lawyers and activists and legal workers who are interested in doing jail support can know to look for those people sort of at the back end of the process, and make sure that everyone who is arrested is released or accounted for. So that's legal observers. Frequently at protests, you will see volunteer medics who have some, usually a Red Cross on tape or some other similar designation, who are there to, help people if they're injured by the police or otherwise. Depending on the level of organization of the protest, there's frequently also other support available, not necessarily from lawyers, to help people navigate the system, the criminal penal system. A lot of times at protests that will involve jail support, and jail support frequently in New York takes the form of people who find out where arrestees at protests are brought, which precinct or arrest processing location they're brought to, and physically go there and greet people as they walk out of the door of the precinct and offer them different kinds of assistance, food, water. Sometimes there are people on hand to help them deal with the trauma that they've just experienced. So jail support is one role. Sometimes there's bail support, meaning there's bail available if people get arrested, on more serious charges, and bail is set. And finally, there is sometimes, again, depending on sort of the nature and level of organization of the action, there can be more ongoing court support, where people will show up to court and help remind people of court dates and help people deal with navigating the longer term process, if there is a longer term process. And then the other players, major players in protest situations, and I'm really focusing on New York. Some of what I'll say will be applicable elsewhere, but I'm a New York City lawyer and I know the laws in New York, and so the local law stuff is all going to be about New York. The other players on the scene are the police, right? And so, the police response depends on all kinds of factors: the politics of the organizers, whether there are permits for the event, the degree to which the police think that the organizers or the people participating are going to be compliant or not, how well behaved they think they're going to be. Based on those and other factors, the police response can vary pretty wildly. The police certainly have the resources to escort and facilitate most protests, and when they decide they're going to do that and have a hands-off approach, they're capable of doing that. And but the NYPD's response to protests tends to be much more aggressive, particularly if the police department decides that it's an organization or a form of protest that they don't like. Rather than deploying resources that could accommodate that form of protest, the police department tends to take a tack of being very aggressive. And so, unfortunately, the NYPD employs tactics such as using force without first giving people a warning, or without a justification that's individualized, or if they're doing something like using pepper spray or a long-range acoustic device, using force without against sort of a crowd as a unit, without first giving people notice that they're going to do it and an opportunity to dissociate themselves with the crowd, which is what they're supposed to do. Police engage in kettling or trapping people, and not giving them an opportunity to leave, and sometimes detaining them for long periods of time, sometimes arresting and charging them. And and also it's just a reality that going to a protest in New York City these days you expose yourself to surveillance by the police department. That's through facial recognition, police officers, videotaping protesters. It's through if people are arrested, the police department trying to collect DNA from arrestees, frequently through trickery. Sometimes it's in the form of the police department searching cell phones or searching data from cell phones. So, the bottom line is the police on the streets, they can escort and facilitate, or they can do just the opposite. And it's really up to them and very difficult to predict. So you should remember, all of that is by way of saying you should remember that, you have legal rights and they exist and they're important. But on the streets, it's the cops who have the physical power to do what they want and through force. And so, there are times when the best that you can do and the safest thing that you can do in order to exercise your rights is to know that they're being violated and to do your best to document that in a way that might lead to some accountability down the road. But I don't know of anyone who's been able to sort of talk themselves out of one of these hyper aggressive police situations once they've decided to change the tone of the protest. So those are some general risks. Certain people, because of their status and either their identity or their perceived identity, are at higher risk. That includes people who are non-citizens, Black, Indigenous, people of color, trans or gender non-conforming people, people who have medical issues or need to take medications, people with open criminal cases or open warrants, people who have certain licenses that require them to report arrests or convictions, or people who have jobs who require them to make such reports. Those are all categories of people who are more at risk in various ways attending a protest. There are thankfully ways to minimize at least some of those risks. Aside from and on the way to abolishing the police, hopefully. Some of those ways involve planning ahead of time, going with other people, having a plan about what to do if you're arrested or if someone that you're with is arrested. If you don't go with other people, having someone who's not there who you're going to check in with, who they know, at certain time periods, and they know if they don't hear from you, that they should start looking for you. And, if you are going to a protest and you have a pet or a child or, someone else who you need to take care of, you need to plan to have someone help you and step in and help you in the event that you're detained and you're not out in a reasonably quick time period. When you go to a protest, you should think about taking care of yourself physically, not to be, sort of the Jewish mother, although I am, water, food, sunscreen, Band-Aids, earplugs, all of those kinds of things you should think about. You should think about bringing. And, if you do end up getting arrested and you don't have access to food or water for a number of hours, then you'd be glad that, you planned ahead and you had those resources available. If you're going to bring a phone, which, if they arrest you or even if they don't arrest you, can expose you to different kinds of surveillance, then charge it, make sure it's charged and you can communicate with the people you're supposed to check in with, or, leave your phone at home, bring a burner phone. There are security measures that you can take, to minimize to make it more difficult for the government, including the police department, to break into your phone without your consent or without a warrant. So those are all things you can do to minimize your risks. Something else you can do that's concrete is don't bring anything with you to the protest that you wouldn't want the cops finding on you. That means, leave your weed at home. That means leave, the weapons that you don't want the police to arrest you with at home, your folding knife or whatever. very frequently people just don't think of those things necessarily, and you know, and a bus that would have otherwise been a ticket and out in 2 hours, you know, turns into something more, maybe a little more, maybe more. Um, the most, okay, so that brings us to your rights, and I'm mostly going to, um, and that most, yes, I'm sorry, I'm just seeing in the chat for a minute. Uh, uh, it's a natural point to pause for a second. So I don't know the answer to the question that someone has asked about if you bring a mobile phone, but the phone is fully powered off, can the phone and data still be surveilled? I think the answer to that is probably yes, but I don't really know. I'm just making that up. Um, and I do want to remind people that public defenders are real lawyers. They're, in fact, among the realest lawyers. And yeah, most are both quite dedicated to their clients and the causes that protesters are dedicated to. So when I get to the point a little bit later talking about legal representation, I certainly intend to and will emphasize that again, because you know, everyone who's arrested will be, you know, who's arrested is appointed a lawyer, and in most cases, that lawyer is going to be from Legal Aid Society or another institutional public defender. And when there are large-scale arrests in particular, there are sometimes conflicts, and so you have a number of public defenders and appointed lawyers, and sometimes when there are conflicts, that number can grow quite big if there's a large mass defense, and et cetera. But public defenders, as always, are on the front lines of representing people and protecting their rights. Speaking of those rights, in terms of protests specifically, different city spaces are differently regulated, both in terms of First Amendment protections and in terms of the permitting regimes that potentially apply to them. The most typical protests on streets, sidewalks, and public parks take place in what are considered traditional public fora, which means that, you know, for time immemorial, they have been reserved for public debate and gathering and expression. So, you know, protected speech and assembly has its greatest protection in streets, sidewalks, parks, and other traditional public fora. Private property stands at the other end of the spectrum. It's different. Generally, you know, private actors can restrict your First Amendment conduct. You know, if you're an invitee and you're in a private place by invitation, it's somewhere that's open to the public, you know, someone with authority generally needs to kick you out before they can seek to arrest you for trespassing. But your rights are different on private property. And then there's, you know, there are categories of property that fall somewhere in between a traditional public forum and something that's not a public forum. Like, for example, a privately owned public place, such as Zuccotti Park, which is where Occupy Wall Street had its occupation. Part of the reason that the cops did not kick protesters out of Zuccotti Park initially is because it was a privately owned public space, and there were legal questions about, you know, who had the authority to do that and when it could be done, et cetera. Of course, they found out a way, but another category of property that's regulated differently is federal property. So if you're talking about, you know, doing an action on federal property, there, you know, is yet another or other layers of regulation and, you know, potential penalties, et cetera. So in terms of your constitutional rights, the First Amendment guarantees you the right to assemble and express yourself. It also grants people the right to observe and document uniformed police conduct in a public place. It's always subject to reasonable regulations, including regulations that are based on officer or arrestee safety. And, you know, I think at this point, you know, I want to point out that, you know, although you have the right to observe and document police conduct and, you know, the conduct of protesters in public places, you know, if you document police conduct, you know, you can sometimes use that to pursue accountability when there's misconduct. Sometimes documenting the conduct of protesters even though it might seem quite innocuous to you at the time, can lead to charges being brought against people, whether right or wrong, down the road. Because, for example, you capture somebody in the background who has a black bandana around their head and tattoo on their arm, and the cops think that that person did something nefarious 2 blocks down the road. Your picture, your footage can sometimes provide the link, that can expose people to further consequences, whether right or wrong. So those are risks that people should be aware of. There's often a tension between sort of journalists' interpretations of their reporting obligations, for example, and the potential that reporting in certain ways could lead to harm to protesters, and that's frankly a real tension. The First Amendment is supposed to be robust enough to accommodate some discommoding of traffic and other public inconvenience. That's part of the point. But all First Amendment protected conduct is subject to reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. So that means that as long as the government, the restrictions the government imposes on the time, the location, or the way that you're expressing yourself are reasonable under the circumstances, then they will generally be upheld. A regulation that the government is imposing because of the content of your speech is hard for the government to justify and uphold, right? So if the police come in and say, we don't like your FTP march, so we're not going to let you march, that is not going to pass constitutional muster. But if the police impose a content neutral regulation, if they say, we don't care about the content of your march, but you're going to have to stay on the sidewalk, because if you go in the street, then you're going to obstruct too much traffic and make a problem for emergency vehicles. They would argue that that is constitutional and that it meets the standard that regulations that are content neutral have to be narrowly tailored to serve a legitimate governmental interest, which means that they don't have to be the least restrictive means, but they can't restrict substantially more speech than is necessary to achieve whatever the government's legitimate objectives are. In order for even a content neutral regulation on your protected conduct to pass muster, it also has to provide the regulation. There also has to be ample alternatives for the protected expression that you want to give. So that's an overview of sort of some of the First Amendment rights that come into play. There's also, and I'll touch on these pretty quickly, the Fourth Amendment, which among other things prohibits certain searches and seizures, whether it's of you or your phone or other things. The Fourth Amendment, when you're being arrested, also governs whether you might have a potential excessive force claim if the police use physical force that's unreasonable, objectively unreasonable under all of the facts and circumstances, then that can amount to a Fourth Amendment violation. You also have due process rights. If you're not arrested and the police use force on you, that is objectively unreasonable under the circumstances, then it's a little bit of a different analysis, but you have the right to be free from unreasonable uses of force by the government, whether you're under arrest or whether they don't actually arrest you, they just hurt you. You also have due process rights with respect to your property, for example. If the police arrest you, they're supposed to, and they take your property, they're supposed to either give it back to you or give you documentation of what they took, why they took it, and how you can get it back. And if they don't do those things, then they may be violating your due process rights. Everybody has the rights to equal protection of the laws. And people, importantly, also have the right to remain silent and the right to legal counsel, which takes me back to, the 4 things to say. Am I free to leave? I do not consent to the search. I want to talk to a lawyer, and I want to remain silent. I'm going to talk a little bit about permits, arrests and arrest processing, and common charges, and I think that's going to take us pretty close to the end of my time, and then we can kind of do Q&A. So in New York City, there are certain permitting regimes that technically apply if you are going to be engaging in a parade, procession, or a race on a public city street, or if you are going to use any type of amplified sound, or if you're going to have an event in a park with more than 20 people or within 350 feet of a park. If you're going to do a parade, procession, or race that has 50 or more people in the roadway, the police department requires that you get prior written permission and get a parade permit. Otherwise, they say you may be charged with parading without a permit. If you want to use amplified sound of any kind in New York City, you are supposed to have a sound permit from the police department, unless it's a park, in which case there's a separate permitting regime that applies. And if you are in any event in a city park that has 20 or more people, or is expected to have 20 or more people, is supposed to have a written permit from the city parks commissioner. I'm mentioning those requirements not because I'm recommending that people comply with them necessarily. I don't take a position on that. I think these are incredibly onerous permitting schemes that make it very difficult for people to exercise their rights. Most of the time, the police department or the parks department has the information that they need to make sure that these events go off safely, and they basically use these permitting regimes as excuses to crack down on people when they feel like it and ignore them otherwise. And so, they're selectively enforced. It's incredibly difficult. Both the police department and the parks department don't follow their own rules about, the permitting process. So these are extremely onerous processes, but they do exist, and the police department will sometimes use noncompliance as a pretext for policing the event differently or for lodging different charges against people if they're arrested. If you're arrested in connection with a protest, or if you think you might be under arrest in connection with a protest, you can and you should ask if you're free to leave. And if you are free to leave, then you should leave. If you're not free to leave, then you should make it clear that you don't consent to any searches by saying that out loud. And you can say that out loud more than one time, during the process, and you should. You can then also say, and you should say, I want to talk to a lawyer and I want to remain silent. The sort of exception to remaining silent is that if the police have arrested you and they're going to process you, meaning they're going to not just let you go, then and if they're going to write you a summons or a desk appearance ticket, and they don't have your identification, then they can determine that you're not eligible to get either of those, and basically hold you longer or put you through the system more. Summons is usually a pink piece of paper, either a pink or a yellow piece of paper, that tells you that you have to come back to court at a later date to face certain charges. A pink summons is returnable in a criminal court, and a yellow summons is returnable in a civil administrative proceeding, usually before the Office of Administrative Trials and Hearings, or oath. Sometimes, though, it can be a transit adjudication bureau summons. But a summons is one type of criminal process rather that you can end up with when you're arrested. Usually, summonses are issued on the street, but in protests, the police will lock people up and hold them for somewhere between usually 2 and about 10 hours before releasing them with summonses. A desk appearance ticket is another possibility. Desk appearance ticket, like a summons, tells you have to come back to court later. Unlike a summons, a desk appearance ticket doesn't tell you exactly what you're charged with. It tells you usually one or a few charges that the cops want to charge you with. But with a desk appearance ticket, the police have to go to the prosecutor, talk to a prosecutor, and the prosecutor decides what to charge or not charge. Another possibility is that you could be put all the way through the system. If you're arrested in a protest and they're thinking about charging you with a felony, certain kinds of misdemeanors, they'll put you all the way through the system. They have discretion to do this or not do this. They have policies that are written in the patrol guide about who's eligible for summons, who's eligible for a desk appearance ticket, who gets put all the way through the system. But they change those policies at will when it comes to protests. Once you're arrested, they'll usually take you to a precinct if there's a relatively small number of arrests in a protest situation. But with large-scale arrests, the police department tends to take people to a large-scale or mass arrest processing center. A lot of times it's downtown at one police plaza. You have the rights to phone call, food, water, bathroom, basic hygiene, medical attention, to be referred to by your correct pronouns, to be properly gendered, to be housed with, to be properly housed. And all of those are rights that you have. Often in these large-scale arrest processing situations, the police don't provide phone calls, food, water, bathrooms, etc. In New York, since the pandemic, there's no social distancing, in these facilities, no masks that the police provide. And in fact, the police are taking people's masks away. We sort of talked about asserting your rights, but just to go over this part one more time, am I free to leave? If so, leave. If not, then you can't leave. You should be sure to say that you don't consent to any search. You should be sure to say that you want to talk to a lawyer and that you want to remain silent. And then remain silent, right? Except if you want to talk to a lawyer. Sometimes people are like, I told them I wanted to talk to a lawyer, and then I talked to them for 2 hours, but I know they can't use it because I said I wanted to talk to a lawyer. Well, don't do that. A lot of times in large-scale arrest situations, people's cuffs are tight. They use plastic flex cuffs. If your cuffs are tight, if you need medical attention, if you need to go to the bathroom, if you need food, a phone call, water, any of those things, you should always be assertive about asking to get those things and following up. And if it's possible to document the identities of the officers who don't respond and to have some idea of when that happens, that's best. But obviously that's not something that can always happen. Some common charges. Most of the charges that the police in New York levy against protesters are violations, which are non-criminal offenses. There are also some crimes, and there are, for example, violations of certain Parks Department regulations, even ones that we would think are pretty innocuous, are technically crimes, misdemeanors, and so if there are arrests in a park, frequently those will show up. I know we're getting very close to time, so I'm going to push through sort of the very end here. So a few typical charges in New York City protest contexts: parading without a permit. The reality is the last time the police department really charged parading without a permit, sort of en masse, was the RNC in 2004, and some of the critical mass cases after that. My first solo trial, we lost half of it, but the part that we won, the judge said that the parade permitting law in New York City was unconstitutional. So the police department had to basically rewrite the law, and although it's still on the books and applies to groups of 50 or more on streets, it's not something that anybody has charged since probably 2006 or so. The most typical charges are disorderly conduct, which are non-criminal violations. The police department will also frequently charge what's called Vehicle and Traffic Law 1156A, which prohibits walking in a roadway when there's a usable sidewalk available, which is actually a law that's on the books and applies in the city of New York, if you can believe it. And those are sort of what I would say are the vanilla, most common protest charges. If people are perceived by the police to engage in any kind of physical acts of resistance, then the police will also often add resisting arrest and or obstruction of governmental administration, which are misdemeanor criminal charges. People can also catch misdemeanor charges over chalking, making graffiti, possession of graffiti instruments, criminal mischief, are the types of charges that police and prosecutors charge in those kinds of cases. I think the relatively good news, I hope, is that in most of these cases, and even the cases the sort of typical cases involving um, obstruction of governmental administration or resisting arrest type charges, the most common dispositions are either dismissals or what are called adjournment and contemplation of dismissals, or ACDs. And the ACD is an offer where if you accept it, the case is taken off the court's calendar for 6 months and then automatically dismissed and sealed after 6 months if you're not rearrested. If you are rearrested or given a criminal summons during that time period, the case can come back on the court's calendar. It can be restored. But that doesn't always happen, and certainly in summons court, it very infrequently happens. So an ACD is another possible and very common disposition. And then another disposition that it's common is a guilty plea to a non-criminal violation. Usually it's disorderly conduct or an administrative code provision that's a lot like disorderly conduct. It's non-criminal. It is sealed off of your record, or that a guilty plea to a violation like that is supposed to be sealed off of your record after a year. So very quickly in conclusion, take care of yourself, plan ahead if you're going to go to a protest. You should always talk to a lawyer if you need legal advice. To circle back to one other issue, everyone under a case that I was named after, Gideon versus Wainwright, by my then public defender father and mom, non-public defender, also lawyer. People who can't afford legal representation in most criminal matters are assigned public defenders to represent them in court. So everyone, the bottom line is if you are arrested, you're going to get quality legal representation. It's either going to come from public defenders who are assigned or conflict providers. In New York, there are 18B lawyers who will do some of those conflict cases. And then also, I've never had the pleasure of being a public defender. I cut my teeth doing criminal cases, doing protest cases through the National Lawyers Guild, New York City chapter. And I work with and train lawyers to do these kinds of cases, who volunteer lawyers through the Guild to do these kinds of cases too. So often what ends up happening in a large scale arrest where there are criminal cases down the road is there's some combination of public defenders, volunteer attorneys from the Guild or from other kinds of organizations, who engage in some kind of coordinated representation or mass defense. And I know we're getting pretty close to time. I don't know if people have questions.
Looks like we have one question in chat, and then if not, I have a ton, like I said, so I'm happy to field those to you after. Looks like Linda has a question over here.
I see. So it looks like the question is, I've heard in addition to asking, am I free to leave, you should also ask, am I under arrest, and leave if you're not under arrest. And if they say you're under arrest, you should ask what the charges are. It's always great to ask what the charges are. They don't necessarily need to tell you what the charges are. I mean, there's certainly no constitutional obligation for them to tell you what the charges are when they arrest you. I mean, they do have an obligation eventually to tell you what the charges are, but that's not necessarily the moment. That's like most other things in terms of interacting with the police, you kind of have to gauge your safety level, and then decide if asking the question is, likely to expose you to some further risk or get you some remedy that you might want. In terms of the distinction between am I free to leave and am I under arrest, I don't think there's a legal distinction there that I see. If you're free, sometimes that's not to say that there aren't legal distinctions between being detained and arrested. There are in different contexts, they have different significance. But in terms of asking a cop on the street, am I free to leave or am I under arrest? The cop might say, no, you're not under arrest, but you still might not be free to leave. So if the answer to the question, am I free to leave, is yes, then get out of there. And if the answer is no, then you're under arrest.
Awesome. So I hope people are taking notes. This is really thank you so much. And as a reminder, in case you came in a little late, we are recording this and we will be posting it. So follow us at Books Are Magic BK if you want an update for when that's up. In the meantime, I have a ton, so I'll just field whatever, kind of going back to what you were saying about the bills that like the kind of speaking to the policy changes that they frequently kind of use their discretion of whether or not they're going to enforce certain laws or not. My question is, do you know of any current bills or legislation that we as New Yorkers should be paying attention to right now, either locally or like heading towards the Supreme Court?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the answer is no, and you know, and here's what I think about that. The police department in New York has been doing the same bad things in terms of policing protesters for decades. You know, it's been refining and changing some of these same policies and practices, kettling people, the excessive uses of force. There are a number of them that we challenge sort of over and over in, civil rights litigation. And the point of all those lawsuits is supposed to be that the city pays enough money that somebody at some point decides there should be policy change and legislators step in, or, there's some kind of oversight. But the police department, in New York City is totally out of control. The city council has never, in terms of the police department's policing of protests, has never done, in my opinion, anything remotely serious to exercise any kind of basic oversight authority. The most the city council has done is every once in a while hold some hearings and, people, wave pieces of paper around. But in terms of actual oversight, I'm not aware of any, any legislative action or bills that would address this problem. And perhaps and hopefully taking a lot of money away from the police will send them the message that they should be doing something different. I mean, through the budget, not through civil rights litigation. But it's unfortunate that there is so little meaningful oversight. In D.C., after the police response to protests in 2002, the DC passed the First Amendment Act that actually had a lot of aspects that we tried to pitch and get some action on in New York City back in around 2005 and 2006, and there wasn't political will to do it then. Maybe there will be now going forward. I mean, the city council certainly could step in and exercise some oversight, exercise the power of the purse and some other oversight, but they're not there. They're not doing it.
Okay. Well, that gets rid of my next question. I was going to ask how we can pressure our local government officials to act in accordance with those needs. But I was wondering if we can go back for a second to earlier you were talking about the different roles that people take, kind of peripheral to protesting. And I was wondering if folks who are medics, legal witnesses, journalists, reporters, folks doing jail support, kind of if they have certain rights or certain things that they should keep in mind during those police confrontations. Because as you know, we're seeing all these journalists, even legal witnesses being detained. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that shouldn't be happening is the first thing that I would say about it. I mean, it's another, I'd say it's another symptom of the the long-term problems I was talking about before. I mean, ultimately the problems with policing in general, but institutionally and talking about the NYPD, long-term problems in terms of the history and practices. Legal observers don't have and members of the press don't, necessarily have more First Amendment rights than a protester or an observer who's not a member of the press or who's not a legal observer. But legal observers and members of the press and people who are not credentialed members of the press who are, performing press functions do have First Amendment rights. They have First Amendment rights that are always going to be subject to that narrow tailoring, ample alternatives analysis that I mentioned before if the governmental regulation is content neutral. So, you can get more granular if you're talking about filming the cops arresting somebody, for example, right? Like they can keep you far enough away that they're going to be safe and that the, person that they're arresting, according to them, is going to be safe, from you, right? But if they're doing that in a manner that prevents you from being able to record what they're doing, observe or record what they're doing, then certainly you have an argument there that that is not a narrowly tailored regulation. Maybe it is for the first 5 feet, right? But 10 feet, whatever it is, beyond that, certainly there's a strong argument to be made that that person's First Amendment rights are being violated. But that would be the case if the person were a member of the press, if they were a family member, if they were a bystander, if they were a lawyer. That's just the First Amendment. It's not some some bump up.
Another question I had was, so like one of the kind of few things folks can do during when confronted with police misconduct is to ask for, as you mentioned, like their badge number and name. Is there anything that can be done if they choose not to provide it? And second part to that question is, do undercover cops have more protections that protesters or witnesses should be aware of?
I'll start with the second. I mean, the answer is yes. Certainly from the police perspective, the answer is yes. But from their wandering around in public, doing stuff in public perspective, you have the right to document them just like you would have the right to document me. Of course, sometimes the police department says, if you're trying to do this to, if you're trying to do this to, identify these officers so people can hurt them, then, they'll, get all bent out of shape about it. But the truth is, I think that's something that happens very rarely. And if they're out there doing dirt in public, then you have the right to document it and, in a way that's safe.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, the first question was, I forgot the first part.
The first question was just, is there anything that
yes,
witnesses can do if they refuse?
Thank you. Yes, take their picture. If you can. I mean, so when under NYPD regulations, when under some circumstances, officers are allowed to wear these mourning badges, right? And these mourning bands, sorry. And they're these little black bands that they put on the shield. And if they're on there correctly, they're not going to obscure their name or their shield number, but most cops, surprise, surprise, put them on incorrectly so that they do obscure the shield number and the name. The NYPD patrol guide requires that police officers respond to requests for them to identify themselves by giving their name and shield number. And now the Right to Know Act, also requires the police to do that. But if they don't, your options are to document who they are, take a picture. Frequently, even if their shield number is covered up, sometimes on the badge. Sometimes if they're wearing a riot gear helmet, it'll be up on the helmet. You can sometimes pull ranks off of insignias, or other things. And very frequently, you can tell what precinct they're from. So if you want to make a complaint to the Civilian Complaint Review Board or to the Internal Affairs Bureau about those kinds of things, then you can. They shouldn't be doing that is the bottom line. It's a violation of police procedure. And then, eventually it's also something more serious than that. We can't identify them when we need to sue them, et cetera. So they shouldn't be doing that.
Mm-hmm. I just lost my thought. I had a follow-up question to that. I'll circle back. I was wondering if you could, and you touched on this earlier, but I was wondering if you could speak to, I keep losing it, the role of undocumented folks. And I know that New York is technically a sanctuary city, but there's been reports of the NYPD working with ICE. Are there certain things that undocumented folks out in the street should be aware of that are particular to them but might not apply to folks with citizenship?
A great question. Thank you for asking it. I think anyone who is a non-citizen who is going to attend a protest and wants legal advice about what to do about that and is in New York should get in touch with the Immigrant Defense Project at 212-725-6422. And I'll just paste that into the chat. IDP attorneys can give legal advice that's specific to, immigration law is incredibly complex and always changing, frequently for the worse, unfortunately. And, that's my piece of advice for people who might need immigration related advice and consequences advice is that it is so specific to individual situations. You need to talk to an expert. IDP is the place that I would go, to get those questions. In terms of the city being a sanctuary city, that's always really been, bull, because in terms of like the criminal end of things, because if you're arrested and the police take your fingerprints, the fingerprints go to the federal government, and all the talk about the city being a sanctuary city, there are other examples like that of that end of the criminal engaging with police that can expose people who are non-citizens to different collateral consequences. One other thing that you made me think of too is that the NYPD is not supposed to subject people who are arrested to questioning about their political beliefs, but they have a history of doing this in protest-related arrests. Beyond the scope of the talk to talk about the handshoe case, but there is basically an ongoing case that is supposed to prohibit or at least regulate certain kinds of political gathering information and doing investigations into political activities. One thing that we saw recently with George Floyd Black Lives Matter protests was a resurgence of the police departments bringing FBI agents in to try and question activists, along with officers from the NYPD's intelligence division. And people, if you're in that situation, we've already gone over at least 3 times what you should do, which is to say, I want to remain silent and I want to talk to a lawyer. And all the time, people who know this will then say, so I said that, and then I talked to them for 20 minutes, and you think you're having an innocent conversation, but a lot, you give them details about what you ate for breakfast that morning, and they're going and telling the next person that they talked to that they know everything about your life, including what you ate for breakfast that morning. There's really not innocent chit chat with law enforcement. So and with federal agents, if you lie to a federal agent about something that's material, it's a 1001 violation. It's a charge, right? And so remaining silent is something that you have the right to do, but opening your mouth and potentially saying something that they could construe as a misrepresentation can lead to serious problems. So that's something else that people should know. And I would also be remiss if on a books related Zoom, I didn't say, that everybody should read Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis, and who wrote my law school letter of recommendation. Thank you, Dr. Davis.
Oh, wow.
So especially and many other works, especially by abolitionists who've been at it for a long time, and especially Black women, who there's a lot of good scholarship and activism out there to be had around abolition and abolition issues, which ultimately, I think if you're talking about, to me at least, about police misconduct, we have to be talking about abolition as well, because there's a lot of tinkering and reform that can be done within these institutions. But as someone who's spent literally my entire career trying to pursue accountability, they're incredibly limited, and so ultimately I think we should be talking about and moving toward abolition.
I agree. I highly recommend everyone check out the On the Road to Abolition on YouTube with Dr. Angela Davis, and check out on Dream Defenders Facebook. They did a live with a stellar group of abolitionists. Highly recommend. One quick follow-up question to what you were saying before. Do people have a right to a translator? You had mentioned, like the 4 basic questions people should ask. Just to absolutely be positive, are those questions they can also ask ICE officers, and also the translation thing?
You can use those phrases with all law enforcement. I'm not giving, The answer is you can use those phrases with all law enforcement. There may be, minute changes that other people would recommend to make in particular situations. Like, for example, am I being arrested rather than am I being detained? But when I do these, this is a sort of those are sort of four one size fits all things. And yes, the answer is you do have a right to an interpreter. That's the simple answer to that question. How to get one, if they don't want to give you one, it's like the same answer as how do you get them to cut your cuffs off when they're cutting off your circulation. You have to be as persistent as you can be safely to hopefully get the response that you need without having more heat come down on you.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I think we're just out of time, but if anyone has any last minute questions,
can I just add a plug for the National Lawyers Guild New York City chapter and the National Lawyers Guild generally, but the NLG is a national organization. The NLG NYC is the city chapter here in New York that I've been a volunteer with for my whole career. It's nlgnyc.org. If people are organizing events and want NLG legal observers, you can call the chapter at 212-679-6018, or you can go to nlgnyc.org to request legal observers. You can also contact the chapter if you want to talk about other legal support for an action. In the links in the chat, there's also a link to a Twitter thread from Jerome Greco, who's at Legal Aid Society's DNA unit, which is about some sort of cyber safety tips to follow at protests. And finally, if you were arrested during the recent George Floyd Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and you want legal advice from a civil attorney, then you can send your name, contact info, and the location of the incident only, nothing else, to NYC Civil Rights at nlg.org, and a lawyer will get back.